right, welcome. This is a first dry run, very raw test of a Dandelion mixing session. This is my track Sunrise, and this is going to be a mixing and editing session as a test run. So here you can see we have the track Sunrise. It is arranged, and as you can see, everything is MIDI right now, and in the mixing board, we have just a ton of plugins active. So, despite using a very long buffer, I am having a large CPU load right now, so this could be a bit of a boring session, just bouncing some of this to audio, but we're going to be talking about mixing and arranging and sound design and fun things like that as we go. So let's dive into it. Gonna just start from the beginning, and when we're gonna do a rough listen through, and there's gonna be some CPU crashes for sure. But what we're doing is looking for any areas where the arrangement maybe isn't fully finished yet. So this should be just quick fixes, making sure things are in the right place. And then when that happens, we are going to bounce things to audio, print the audio, and remove any plugins that are unnecessary. So what we're going to be doing is printing the audio with a lot of the effects on it, assuming there isn't anything that I just despise and don't know what I was thinking at the time when I made it, and we'll bounce them down and reduce the CPU load so that we can really get into mixing. So we're going to go for about an hour here and just see what happens. Okay, so right off the bat, shimmer is looks like the shimmer on the piano lead here is coming in when it shouldn't be, so we'll have to fix that. Whether that's just a fade in or maybe it's a parameter is initialized. Yeah, I just heard it again. It's happening right at the start of each clip. All that, nothing needs to get fixed there, that's all ready to bounce. Okay, builds are normally really CPU intensive. There's normally a lot of automation going on, and especially right here with the pad stacks. If we go into that, you can see 4 different oscillators are present. That's a Harmer. I believe this is a Serum. Yep. 2 Harmers and a Serum. Noise oscillator probably isn't eating up too much CPU, but for sure at least this CPU is, especially with 16 voices going on. So that's a big reason for the CPU load here. So we're gonna definitely freeze the pad stacks here first. That's eating up a lot of CPU in builds and drops. This bass stack probably is as well. You can see there's 2 basses going on here, both Serums with voices, multiple oscillators, lots of effects, and modulating parameters. So as you can see, LFO is modulating 8 parameters here in this main bass, and I think I actually took this bottom bass out of the track, so yeah, I did. So let's go ahead and at least just turn off, well, that one effect, but everything helps. We may want to add that back in, or something I've been thinking about is moving this bass over to the pad stack just to add in more meat when we're processing. So you can see, actually, let me just give an example here. Since this is a test run of explaining my process and giving you a look inside the music. So let's just give you a preview of the drop, and then we'll jump into these pad stacks and what's going on here. Alright, so let's actually just play just the bass stacks, the pad stacks, and the lead, and the drums. These basses are eating up just a ridiculous amount of CPU. And then this is just channel routing, and I'll explain that later as well. Make sure the LFO and triggers are on. That's something we can explain later as well. Really, really great for workflow. Just having a single LFO, which the pad stack, the sub, the bass stack, and the choir are all routed to, as well as the lead. I like to throw choirs on behind my pad stacks. It just kind of gives everything a little bit of depth and a little more of that epic feeling that I like to go for. And we're going to turn on the drums, make sure the automation is on because I am automating gain and high pass, so we don't want drums to be high passed because that would just kind of defeat the purpose of them. We're going to leave the FX off just to reduce CPU load, and let's turn on the choir here. And this is just kind of the structure of what's going on in a drop minus the basses. Okay, even that's a lot. Let's take off the choir. That's definitely eating up a lot. Yeah, so this is why it's important to bounce stuff. Normally I would have bounced stuff earlier in the process, but I'm always hesitant to bounce out pad stacks because what I've done in the past is I would take just this right here and I would bounce that and then cut up the audio. But I don't really like to do that. I'd prefer to bounce it after I've made the cuts because what's going to happen is say that this right here was bounced to audio and then I cut it. There's going to be just a little bit of tail left from what would be in this blank section here. That's going to be carrying over to here, and to me that's just going to be a little bit of extra mud in the sound. I think it's easier to cut up the MIDI how I want it and do all of my processing. We have 4 different channels for each oscillator here, and so what we're going to do is I'm probably going to take off a few of these plugins. I'll probably take off all of this. I've got saturating, some mid-side EQ, and limiting going on, and that's something I really should be doing last after I've done all of the other mixing. But I probably just know right up front that I'm happy with all of this mixing. So I'm just going to move this up here, and we'll probably insert an instance of Edison here and bounce out just the whole track. And that way we're getting the whole track with all of its EQ and compression in addition to all of the processing going on in each individual channel. And then we have that, like for instance with this Cosmic Pad, you can see there's a Valhalla shimmer. And so what this allows for me to do is just have this audio, have the reverb ringing out here, which I can later cut out or further control. As you can see, I have an instance of Fruity Balance right there. That's this guy post gain, cutting out everything there. So that's just, I could do that with the audio as well, but I really like to just do it with automation so I can draw in these curves to make sure the audio isn't instantly cutting in and back out. which creates clicks and pops in your music. So that's just something to pay attention to. You almost never want anything in music to have an instantaneous change. That just doesn't happen in the real world and in the technological world as well. That'll create nasty little clicks and pops and just imperfections in the audio. Um, so, yeah. But again, you can see right here with all of these synthesizers and all of these processing effects, the computer is just processing a lot right now, 33, 35 different voices, and that's a lot. So let's do just the pad stack here. With that's not playing. Probably because of the LFO. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so here you can see just a ton of the CPU load is just here. Okay, so before we get into freezing stuff, let's, since this is all going to be frozen together and printed to one file, let's go through how I make my pad stacks. So these are the power chords, which is really just a pretty sharp hypersaw. You can see this is nothing fancy. I think that I messed with, yeah, the oscillator's timbre level. So I was boosting the lower frequencies a little, taking out some of the mid-range. This is in the where is this? 4 octaves up. So yeah, so that's generally where the higher hypersols and lead and noise are going to be sitting. So just removing some of that right at the oscillator level. It's best in audio to start with the best sound source possible. For instance, if you were recording a voice or a guitar, you want to get the best settings on the mic and preamp for a vocalist or the amp for a guitar, and make sure you're in a good room. That's going to give you the best audio quality so that you can get better audio quality when you're mixing and engineering. There's a saying in the audio world that you can do as much as you want with a turd, but at the end of the day, you still just have a turd. You can't polish a turd. Something like that. So that's kind of why I did that, and just to give me the kind of timbre I want. And then we have 5 voices of unison, which is pretty common for hypersols, kind of enforcing the lower end. Nice sharp pitch here so that we're getting just a little more of that powerful sound. If you can hear what happens if we were to raise that audio pitch. That's great on a hypersol, a little bit more in the high mid-range. It gives you that nice wide, airy, chorusy effect that really gives drops just this kind of epic feel. Like you almost have this feeling of a big epic cinematic choir, even without using a choir. It just gives that nice broad sound. And what Unison Audio is doing is there's 5 instances of this one oscillator playing, and they're all detuned by a certain amount so that they stand out and so that you can tell that 5 voices are playing. Because if it's all the same, it sounds exactly the same other than this panning. Also, the phase is out of sync there. So right here you can hear nothing's happening. So if 5 of the exact same thing are happening in the electronic world, it's just becoming louder. You're not hearing everything different. But when we have 5 voices and we pan it and we put it out of phase, now you can hear some width coming in, and then we add the detune, and that's really where that character happens, because 5 different voices are playing in different places in the frequency spectrum, left or right, all out of phase with each other, which creates a lot of little tiny cancellations within the audio spectrum, which gives you that interesting feeling. And then with the power chords, I generally like to follow the harmonic spectrum principle, where the lower you are, the less you have going on. So, down here, I'll have a single instance of a subnote, an octave up, a single instance of a top bass note, And then for the power chords, I have just 3 voices, literally just playing open octaves and fifths. I really like that sound. It just gives a little more low end meat to the sound. And then let's move on up to the Hypersol. So this is just an instance of Serum with 16 voices. Normally I would have a second oscillator an octave up. And you can hear that's adding a little more character, but I didn't in this particular track because, first of all, I'm already using 6 voices here. So that's a lot. We could add a lower octave, but that's not really necessary when you add in the choir. Just to jump over to the choir bus real quick, you can see choirs are coming out in the mids a lot and a little bit in the low mids. I've cut some of that to remove some boominess, which we'll get into later, but ultimately when it comes together, or when it comes to putting together pad stacks, it's about just balancing things and making sure everything has its home in the spectrum. So as much as there is going on here, I am paying attention to making sure there's not too much of any one thing going on in any part of the frequency spectrum. And you can see even here on the pad stack, I've cut out around 700 hertz where the bass has a lot of presence, and around 3 kilohertz where I'm guessing I've boosted the lead, maybe a little bit of this cosmic pad here. So let's move on to that. Okay, so something just to kind of reinforce the Hypersol. This is actually just a preset in Harmor. It's the Aural Synapse lead, but the Aural Synapse lead normally has, I think I've tweaked some of the FX, and then leads are normally panned in the center. So they stand out a little bit from pad stacks, but I'm using this as part of the pad stack. So we've panned that to add a little more width on the high end to the Hypersol. So if we play the Hypersol and then add this cosmic pad layer, it just gives a little more space, a little more of an ethereal feel to it. And then with pad stacks, it's really common to just add a noise of white, or a layer of white noise. It adds more presence and clarity, and just a little bit more of a really an atonal sound. White noise is atonal, and it just adds that full presence to the top end. And the white noise is really just being low cut in the mids, boosted above 10 kilohertz, which is where a lot of shimmer and sparkle and presence live. Boosting it. Oops. I'm just grabbing the wrong things right here. Let's undo that. There we go. So if I were to grab, so boosting it in the presence or high mids range is just going to interfere with everything else going on. So what we're doing is just a little bit of a boost here. And you know what? Let's actually, yeah, I think that's a little nicer. We're gonna boost that just above. Yeah, that sounds nice. Above 9 kilohertz. Just boost kind of the whole area. So that's just a little bit flatter. And that adds just a tiny bit more, which is going to help that pad stack really sit up front and center in the total mix. So all said and done, the whole thing together sounds like this. And you can see, so here I've just disabled this EQ where I'm actually boosting some of the low end. I believe on the individual channels I've probably cut out a lot of low end and boosted a lot of the low high, so I just wanted to add a little bit of low end back to add some more warmth to the mix. It's really important not to take out too much of the low mids. Certain single elements you can take that out and need to, but for a pad stack you generally have a lot of presence, around 200, 250 hertz, just to add warmth and really make it a full sound. We may even end up adding more back in there. We'll see how it sounds in the full mix once everything's bounced out and we can hear everything clearly without the CPU crashing. And then just some multiband compression to add in some more character. Yeah, it's that low end boost. You can hear it's just a really small difference because there's not much going on there. But it just helps it sound less hollow. And then the compressor. We're just kind of compressing different parts of the frequency spectrum individually. And it's probably not doing too much, especially since I'm using RMS compression, but it's really just adding a little bit of character and flattening out just a few of these little spikes like you can see here. Just flattening the signal a little bit, really. Pad stacks should be pretty flat so that they can stay up in center and so that they don't have any pops in the audio. And then another EQ. Yeah, just boosting a little bit more of the low mids, the mids, and this nice little boost around 10 kilohertz. And this is really aimed at kind of just evening out this frequency spectrum so that we have nice flat signal, which we can later do some EQ masking and whatever else needs to be done. Yeah, so that there a little bit too, you can hear a little bit of roominess coming back into the signal. And right there, it's maybe a little bit flat. So just a barely a dB and a half of a boost there just helps the signal a little bit. And then that's just a final low cut to make sure nothing is sitting below 151 hertz. That's where the bass and sub are sitting, so it's important to keep that clean. And there is some reverb here in this chain, so we don't want too much built up here. And now we can see what it sounds like with the bass added in. This bass was the most recent thing I was playing around with. I like what I did with the bass in solo, but I'm not sure how well it's fitting in the track, so we're probably going to rework that, so in this session you'll actually get to see a little bit of sound design. And obviously this bass is eating up a ton of CPU. And then we'll add the sub in, and you can get kind of a full picture of this whole stack that's going on. Yeah, so right off the bat, what I'm thinking here is this whole stack sound is missing some meat. So what I'm thinking of doing is taking this top bass and adding some unison voices. Right now, we do have some unison over here. But I kind of want to high pass this all more, maybe put it through some more OTT, give it a little more sheen, and high cut it and make that a second top layer and add in another bass that's kind of filling in the low mid section. Probably something just like a sine wave with some frequency modulation, probably from a little bit of an altered triangle wave at the same octave, or maybe even something an octave lower to give it that kind of rumbly power in the low mids, and have that frequency modulation be static, not moving like you would see it in a growl bass. That's going to be something worth checking out, but we'll do that once we've frozen a lot of the audio. But so this is just a look inside my process. You can see why, again, it's important to freeze audio. And then just to show you one more thing, here's the pad stack. There's the pad stack with the choir. And I can just tell you right now, this pad stack is too quiet. The choir's too loud. We'll fix that after we've printed everything, but you can see that choir is adding some content back into the low mids, and around maybe 400 or 500 hertz. And when we have this sound, it gives this really epic feeling that I think complement the bass as well. And then with the lead, you can really hear how this is a melodic progression. Yes, that sounds better. And then with the sub, I haven't been able to figure out what the problem is, but something's going on with the sub where it's changing volumes. It probably has something to do with the LFO tool I'm using on my sidechain bus over here. Or the LFO bus. Let's actually see if that's the case right now. Let's do some quick troubleshooting. Nope, it's not that. It's something with Serum. And we'll figure that out. Okay. So, back to going through the arrangement. I know this drop is good. I know this is good. I know this is good. I know this is good. The only thing I want to check on before we start printing stuff is this bridge. So let's see if we can kind of work through this real quick and make sure everything's good, and then we'll start bouncing stuff out. You know what? We're just going to start freezing stuff, and if there's a section I want to edit, we can go back and do that, because we're going to keep all the MIDI. We're just going to disable it once we freeze stuff. So, let's start with the pad stacks. And to reduce CPU, we're just going to isolate this channel. And we're just going to record the whole thing out. And I'm happy with all the processing I've done. Again, we can always go back and edit, but I spent some time on this pad stack. I really like it all. So we're just going to go ahead and record it. And you can hear it's actually really quiet right now. That's because of this bus processing right here isn't enabled, but that is happening over here in the processing channel. Right now we're recording right here on the channel, so that audio will be fine when we're done. So we're just going to let this play out for a minute. And just for my own reference, recording things out is a great spot to just cut this when we're editing. If this is a live stream, this is probably a great opportunity to check chat on the live stream, or see what people are up to on Discord. For recordings, however, we'll cut this out and just kind of edit in the nice juicy moments. realize I'm recording nothing right here, but just being as particular as I am, I prefer to just have one audio file for this whole thing. To me, it's just less cluttered. It'd be interesting to know if making two separate recordings for here and here would make really any difference in the file size or memory. I don't know if it's better to not have that time. So I don't know whether it's better to have two separate audio files or one audio file with some empty space in it. I'm sure somebody else would know. But when I'm in the final mixing stages, I just like to have one big audio file. Just helps my brain. Just as a note here, you can see all of these little peaks in the audio. That's why you did see a limiter on my chain, like something like this peak here. Is not desirable. Pad stacks, especially, really benefit from limiting so that you can just squeeze that audio, make it louder, and not have these little spikes affecting mix bus compression. So this is already pretty good. This is pretty compressed and well processed. But if you do look at professional stems, pad stacks are super clean and super flat. Um, and things like pad stacks and like distorted guitars, a lot of professional engineers will actually drive really hot and hard clip, because in a big sound like that, you're not going to hear a lot of that distortion, and you can just squeeze some extra perceived volume out, which is great. I prefer a limiter, especially ozone limiters, which have really great vintage gear modeling. So we'll go into that in the mixing process. But for right now, that is great. We're going to insert another grouped track here, title it MIDI, and we're just going to select this whole channel, move it down there, and we're going to disable it all, which means it's still here, it's still available for use. But since it's disabled, it's not getting played at all. So that is going to massively improve our CPU performance. And then we're just going to drag this audio in here. We're going to title it Pad Stack, color code it. I'm really anal about color coding. And we're going to make sure it is routed to channel 41. Going to delete this Edison and disable these plugins. And I like to, whenever I record something, I like to leave an empty channel there just to give myself a reminder that, okay, this was printed with these here. So actually, let's just throw the Edison back on there to make sure that's clear. Okay, so we printed up to here in the processing chain, so I know that we don't need to use these. These, however, were not printed, so we will re-enable these, but not now, after everything's printed, just to keep saving some CPU. And then we're going to zoom in here and just make sure everything's lined up nicely, which it's not. A lot of times with Edison, there is a few milliseconds of a delay. So right here, we are nice and lined up. And let's just check the beginning of the audio as well. Perfect. And we're just going to cut that there. Okay. That's the pad stack. And again, let's make sure it's routed to channel 41, which it is not by default. Boom. Okay. Moving on. I know I'm super happy with this trans pad, which is really nice. I've actually turned off this panning. But let's listen to that real quick, because I really like this guy. I use it in actually most of my tracks, and I'll explain why after you hear it. So a lot of producers in electronic music will cut their pianos pretty high, usually around 300 hertz. I usually like to cut them a little lower, um, especially since I have these cinematic verses where there aren't electronic basses or a lot of drums going on. I like to have the low notes of the piano really carrying the melodic progression. We also have a cello here, and we do actually have a sub drone going on. So, in context, yeah, you can hear that pad. It's not all that present. It's just adding this airy, ethereal feel. And my music as Dandelion, I've always wanted to have a very airy feel, this very ethereal, ethereal feeling. Yeah, just really airy. It's just kind of a motif I go back to over and over again. So I always like to have that. It's really quite simple. Let's look at the patch. It's just a Harmer. It's just a Hypersaw with actually only 5 voices. I think I actually like that better with 8. Yeah, odd numbers will give you a voice in the middle. So 6 would be good as well. 8's better. Yeah, it just adds more voices, a little more dissonance, and gives it a nice wide feeling. So with pads, especially in sections where you have a lot going on in the center of your mix, like I have piano, some orchestral drums, a sub drone, um, and a number of other things more towards the middle. So an even number of unison voices will actually help keep sounds a little bit wider and clear in the middle. So this is really nice. And then I'm just modulating a few parameters. We have a little bit of pitch vibrato once it kind of gets held, just to give it a little bit more of that kind of 80s synthesizer feel, which I really like. Normally I like to play with the harmonizer on these kinds of sounds, but I didn't hear because I wanted it's already playing, the notes are pretty high in the frequency spectrum, so I want it to have a little bit of that meat. And then sometimes I'll put a phaser on it as well. I actually really like that. Let's leave that on just a little bit. And I believe this is a downward phaser. Yeah, you can see just these little right there. You can see these little dips in the frequency spectrum, just giving a little more movement. And then a lot of this sound is happening in post-processing. So here's the dry sound. Definitely has that kind of 80s feel. But then we add in the processing. And first I'm low cutting, boosting the sections I like. And then we're throwing on a flanger, however you'd like to say it. Yeah, and that's where a lot of the interesting movement and airiness are happening. And I think this is just a pretty standard flanger patch. And then OTT, this is really key. This is going to bring out a lot of the highs and really accentuate a lot of those odd phase cancellations that are happening between the phaser and the flanger. Really gives it that nice airy feeling. I've used nice long attack and release settings here, and haven't actually really messed with anything else other than turning the depth down, so we're having about an even amount of the dry and wet signal coming through there. Some more EQing, and then a shimmer to give it more of that ethereal sound. And then these swells and pan is what's bringing it in and out and really giving it that living, breathing feeling that I like these pads to have. And that's just being automated right here with these swells. Just kind of, I just drew in a very long LFO. And I was originally panning it back and forth, but in the context of the mix, um, I felt like it was one, a little distracting, and two, taking a little bit away from the fullness of the mix. It kind of sounds cool in solo, but in the context of the mix, which is really important, I did not like it, so I've just recently disabled that. And then just one more equalizer. Actually, just adding a little bit more presence and then boosting the highs to bring out more of that air. And then we have some reverb going on, and this is a nice long reverb, but also with a nice long pre-delay to put it in almost this kind of cathedral space. But this is actually just a Valhalla Vintage preset that I believe I tweaked a little bit, low cut it, tweaked a few of the parameters, and then it has the 1980s coloration on. So as you can read in the text here, this is kind of characteristic of the 1980s sound, where there's just some modulation, bringing out a little bit of the darkness. Yeah, I love that. This is a compelling sound by itself, but with the reverb, just so much more full, and then you can hear it just, you can hear the depth, and that's adding a lot to the mix. And then on the bus, some further EQ, cutting out the lows, boosting a lot of the highs. It's especially important with this reverb going to the bus. And then we're using some tape saturation, which is just, again, bringing a little more airiness to it. In mixes, tape saturation is really common on vocals. Good luck finding a vocal that does not have tape saturation on it. That's what gives it a really nice, pleasant presence to it that we're really accustomed to hearing, especially with the advent of pop music. And yeah, we've, ever since the 70s, 80s maybe, pretty much everything you hear has some tape saturation on it. It just gives it a nice color and fullness. And then also a dimension expander with the size all the way up and the wet to about 50% to really push it to the edges of the frequency spectrum so that all of the orchestral elements have a nice home, more towards the middle of the mix. And then this is just giving it a nice, like, big hug at the edges of the spectrum. And then a final EQ. So that's what's going on there. Again, I really like this sound. And so here we're just going to bounce this out. With all this automation, that's going to save a lot of CPU as well. So we'll be back in a jiff after this is bounced. Oh, and important to note here, I am going to record it on the bus after everything's been done, but before the post gain. That's something that I may have some, yeah, I have some automation going here at the end of the track, but I am sure in the mixing stage I'm going to want to probably bring this up a little bit here, probably automate the volume at different points. So we're just going to record it before that post gain, and then we'll modulate that in the mixing stage. Yeah, and you can see these swells in the audio form. I love that so much. Yeah, just gives it such a lively feeling. Like it makes the track feel like it's breathing, and that's something that's really important to me. And another reason I like to use this exact pad and setup a lot, is that I feel it bridges the orchestral elements with the electronic dubstep drops. I do have this drone bass going on here and a sequenced bass here as well. But other than that, oh, and a synthesized bell, but that sounds somewhat organic. But a core principle of my music as Dandelion is really fusing orchestral cinematic elements with electronic elements, and this pad especially I feel instantly at the start of the track um, gives it that feeling where this is a very, very cinematic verse. But this just, in addition to giving it that breath and life, um, tells you that there are more electronic elements coming. Um, yeah. It's also occurring to me now that I should get an external hard drive just for these videos because these will probably eat up a lot of memory, and my main hard drive is actually pretty small. I have a second internal hard drive that all of my synthesizers and orchestral libraries are on, but all of my startup programs and everything are on this main drive, and I think it's only 500 megabytes, so I do not want to be saving these long um, 2 hour long videos there. So I have another 2 terabyte drive that will probably save all of these too. Yeah, and right there, there's some spikes in the audio, so I know in the mixing stage I'm gonna want to apply some compression. We'll probably do some peak compression with a nice huge knee, so that we'll be getting compression in those valleys as well as in those peaks. And what that'll do, what soft knee compression does, is the louder the signal is, the more it's being compressed, and the softer it is, the less it's being compressed. So in those valleys, we'll get just a little bit of compression, so any peaks there will be cut. Um, and then as it comes up, it'll be compressed more and more. So we'll maintain that breathing feeling, but tighten it up a little bit. And especially with those peaks, we'll probably set the threshold and the knee so that those peaks are really almost being limited, and the rest of the signal is getting maybe like a 3-to-1 compression ratio, and the valleys are getting like a 1.5-to-1 compression ratio. But that's something we'll go into later in the mixing stage. For future reference, I probably could have dipped more at the end of each of these tracks. I cut out the MIDI, but the synthesizer has such a long release. To give it more of that breathing feeling, I probably could let that echo out a little bit more. Maybe put some reverb on it, or maybe just edit this automation. In the mix, it sounds pretty good, but in solo, I'm wishing that the tail of each of these swells would fade out a little bit more. Oh, okay, that's done. It's not paying attention. Oh, fuck. You know what? I need to give that a tail, so let's record out to there. And we're just going to cut this out of the video. But we're going to just record that one more time. And I'm I'm actually going to let this loop for a minute. I'm going to go grab something, so I'll be right back. Since I'm doing this by myself and there's no one to talk to right now. Alright, just fed the cats, made myself some coffee. It's 6 o'clock, but I'm always up till like 2 gaming or working on music, so it's cool. Why is that? God damn it. Okay, we've got to redo that again. I'm just derping pretty hard right here. Okay, and we're just waiting now. This is fun. You know what? I've got a better idea. Let's delete these since I know I'm not going to use them. Disable these as well so we don't have any unused automation eating up CPU. Move that down to the MIDI track. Boom. Rename TrancePad. Color it. Boom. And delete that. Disable that. On this bus, we're individually disabling so that we can leave these on in case I need to go back and edit anything and have these tracks still available to insert. Oh my god. Okay, I'm just being dumb right now. Not paying attention. Just delete that. There we are. That's how that should sound. Perfect. Alright, now... now we're in business. I'm normally better at this, I promise. I'm just goofing up right now. TrancePad. Alright. Oh, that's disabled. Perfect. And now what we're going to do is just copy this over, move this down. Okay, same thing. There we go. Yay. I could just control B this and copy that right now. But sometimes I'm just stubborn. And it's fun to draw things, you know? Alright. There we go. There's our trans pad. That's going to be easier on memory anyways to have just a single individual file instead of one long one. Cool. Also, don't know why that's there. Let's cut that out. Yeah, I don't know. There we go. Okay. And the trans pad is routed to channel 47. There we go. Okay, that's that. We can collapse that. Yeah, so I know I really like the piano as well. That's the next thing we can bounce at. That's eating up a lot of CPU as well. However, with the piano, I'm probably super happy with my processing, but a lot of times, for whatever reason, just the way I do things, I like to record just the raw piano sound, and just leave a little bit of freedom there. Like with the pad stacks, like I know it's good. With the piano, sometimes I like to go back and tweak things. Like compression, attack, and release times are really important. So when we're in the context of mixing, like I may want to make some adjustments to the EQ or like the punchiness of the piano. So I like to just record the raw sound. So we're gonna go ahead and do that. And again, not starting from the right point. So another really important thing in mixing that we'll just touch on right now, while we're just bored listening to this beautiful piano piece, if I may say so, is gain staging. What you'll see with my waveforms is I consistently make sure that they're outputting at minus 18 dB RMS. So you can see right here, the average level of the signal is usually sitting right around there, which is a sweet spot, peaking around 9 dB, minus 9 dB, excuse me. You never want your signal too hot. One of the best ways to get improved audio quality is to record things in this sweet spot. It was especially important in the days of analog gear. But even if you're only mixing in the box or with software, as is known, as I do, is still important because a lot of software is emulating analog gear, where it still does have that sweet spot. And if you drive it too hot, it's going to cause some distortion, which can be great for things like basses. Like you'll see my basses, the waveforms are going to be much larger because I like to record a little bit of a hotter signal and give it a little more distortion character, and drive it into some plugins a little bit hotter just to get a bigger, more aggressive sound. But with a piano or a vocal, it's really important that you have this nice waveform recorded at the proper volume so that it's not going into a compressor hot, or not going into an equalizer hot, or not going into a limiter soft. Um, and especially with organic instruments, obviously this is a piano library, so it's not a live recording, but if we go into the MIDI track, you'll see here I've manually messed with all of the velocities, as well as the timings, so things are just a little bit offset to humanize it and make it sound like a real human is playing a piano. So with any kind of organic element where there are changes in velocity, volume, especially like a human voice or again a piano, you want to make sure you're recording it at a nice quiet volume so that if there is a louder moment, like if a singer is going to have some dynamic range going from soft to loud, you want to make sure that there's still room where all of a sudden if it gets loud, your audio isn't clipping, because then you just have bad audio, and this maybe otherwise great recording that has a moment of unwanted distortion. So it's important to record things at a low volume, and you can see that here. That's a big rookie mistake a lot of producers and maybe aspiring engineers make. So gain staging, guys, make sure you're recording things at an appropriate volume, and when you are mixing, as you're going through your chain, you want to make sure the output of each plugin is the same as the input. So if I'm equalizing and I'm boosting a lot, make sure you bring down the overall output so that it's still putting out the same signal level. Like for instance, my audio levels are great here, but then if I went into an EQ and boosted it a lot, and then went into my compressor, it might be going in hotter, and then if it's coming out even hotter out of the compressor, then it's going into the limiter, and all of a sudden we have to worry about clipping. So make sure you're gain staging and keeping your signal equal throughout your processing chain. And another reason that's important is for A/B comparisons. If I want to go back and actually see if a plugin is making the audio better, in the world of psychoacoustics, we almost always perceive louder as better inherently. And so a lot of times you may have a plugin that's not actually making the audio better, but you think it is because the output's louder, so that just sounds better. So it's important to make sure your input and output are the same, so that when I'm going in and clicking a plugin on and off, bypassing it, I can have an equal comparison to see if I'm really improving the quality of the audio or not. So keep that in mind. And that's something I'll talk a lot about in mixing sessions. Quickest way to improve your audio, it really is. When I really started to get serious about music, after working in a recording studio as a mixing engineer, I went back into my old projects and realized I wasn't gain staging, and so many of my mixes sounded so small and unimpressive and not powerful. And it's kind of counterintuitive because you think you've got a hot signal and you're driving it and it's just getting louder and louder across your signal chain. Why are there two song jumps here? That's not correct. That's not correct. Why is that? let's pay closer attention here. I'm just gonna have to watch this while we're recording. Um, yeah, so I used to have these mixes where I was not gain staging, and so I was just destroying my audio signal on the mixing insert. So, you know, maybe the synthesizer or sample library was putting out the correct volume, and later on in the mixing chain, I was pulling down the fader, and so everything looked like it was the right volumes. But on the actual mixing inserts, my audio was just getting destroyed in between plugins. So it's, again, really important to make sure that you're keeping a consistent level across your chain. And it also just makes the mixing and mastering process easier when you're allowing lots of headroom. I have all of this empty space so that there is room where, you know, if a signal's coming out maybe like a decibel or two hotter out of a plugin, I still don't have to worry about clipping or anything. And then in the final mixing and mastering stage, then your overall signals are low and you don't have to worry about clipping on your master bus. So it's always best to not I shouldn't say always, sometimes it's good to have a hot signal, but until you know when that's beneficial, it is beneficial to get in the practice of gain staging and keeping your signals low. Again, it's counterintuitive, but that is one of the quickest and most effective ways to get a bigger, more professional sound. Turn down the volume. On another note, I really love this piano part. The funny thing is about piano is I can play a little, but I cannot play like this. One of the biggest reasons I got into producing was that I've always had ideas in my head and felt like I've been able to communicate them very well writing them out, whereas I've not always been the most technically proficient musician. I taught myself a little bit of piano, taught myself guitar. You know, I can sing and play campfire songs and whatnot, and I was a good trumpet player. I played trumpet for maybe 12 years, but I could never learn all of the instruments going on in this track well enough to play them. And that's the beauty of modern music, is we have sample libraries, and sample libraries are more or less effective depending on the instrument. Like for strings and piano, they're really great. For some others, maybe you lose a little bit of the human element, but piano is very, very easy to get an almost exactly realistic sound, because when it comes down to it, in the sample library, each single key is recorded at different velocities, and so you're not losing anything by MIDI sequencing from a sample library, because the exact same thing is still happening that would be happening on a real piano, where each one of these MIDI notes is just triggering a key. So piano especially is very easy to compose on with MIDI sequencing and an orchestral sample library. I use East West Quantum Leap, and I love it for a number of reasons. Their sounds are incredible. The wealth of libraries they have is also amazing. Everything from 4 different really classic piano sounds, quality stereo doubling, and a multitude of reverb options, to guitar recordings with amp simulators, even to like synthesizer libraries that like professional ghost producers have put together. So East West just has a ton of stuff. And then another reason I love them is they have a subscription payment plan. So instead of having to pay thousands of dollars for this, I can just pay $30 a month, which is amazing. All right. Okay. So let's insert another one. Do the same thing. We're going to title that MIDI. I never want to delete something like this. I want to keep it in the track exactly where it was as it was so that if I do have to go back and edit, I can. It's great to not pigeonhole yourself. Okay, so let's have a discussion about pigeonholing. Um, it can be a great thing to speed up your workflow to just say something is done and leave it there. Um, and I do that at times, but I really like the freedom of being able to go back and tweak something. And so, in all likelihood, this is going to stay exactly as it is. I'm never going to touch it again. This MIDI is just going to stay here. And once everything's printed and I really start mixing, I probably will delete all of these, but I'll save it as another project file. It's really important to save your project files at all different stages. So I save a copy when I first just do a super loop of just the drop and, designing the sounds, and then I save probably two or three project files while I'm arranging and putting everything together. And then I save another one once I've printed everything and delete the MIDI files. That way I can go back and I've never lost anything. It's also beneficial, especially being somebody who wants to be able to create exclusive content or tutorials, videos, be able to offer value to other people. I want to always have those project files so I can go back, see exactly how I did something, show it to other people, give other people that gift, as well as just for my own sake, being able to go back, over the years and see how I've done things in the past, gain a, big picture appreciation for how I've grown. And yeah, it's just really important to save your work. Yeah. Okay. So that's the piano. This is one thing I do not like about FL Studio. I would really love to submit this to ImageLine. Um, it doesn't save your color scheme. I, I freaking love color coding things. And I use these same colors every time, but every time I open up the project file, it doesn't even remember the colors that I've used in that project. So what I have to do is click on another instance, another clip with the same color, go change color, go into plus, hit OK, and now it's got it there. I really wish you could just save a color scheme. It's the simplest thing, and FL Studio's never done it. It's so stupid, and it's just such a small bone to pick. But I would love if you could just save your color palettes. So, ImageLine, if you're listening, get the fuck on it, man. Just kidding, I love you guys. But seriously. Okay, so channel 54 is the piano chords. Boom. Let's see how we're doing on our CPU now. Let's try going in the drop. This is probably still going to be a mess. Yeah, it's still a mess. Okay, so what I'm going to do is keep bouncing stuff down. And at this point, this video is well over an hour, so I'm going to end this here. This has been a good test. The rest of this is, I'm not making any changes. I'm literally just bouncing stuff down, and this is boring. So, anybody who's watching this, future me, Elias, anybody? Thanks for watching, man. I hope you enjoyed at least parts of it. Hope you maybe learned something. And this has been an interesting first run at recording content. This is the first time I've recorded my production content, and I'm literally just sitting here talking to myself. But I kind of love it. So, yeah, looking forward to doing this more. Peace out, guys. Have a great day, and remember, your only limitation is the extent of your imagination. So keep on dreaming. Keep on dreaming.